Hi class, in Chapter 6 our focus is going to be percents. In Lesson 6.1 we'll be introduced to percents today. 6.2 will be estimating with percents. 6.3 determining the percent of a number. 6.4 determining the part, whole, or percent of percent problems, and we'll be finishing up with using percents in real-world situations. If we take a look at Lesson 6.1, our introduction to percents today, our learning targets will be writing fractions, decimals, and percents. We will look at model percents on a hundredths grid, and finally explain the similarities and differences of percents, fractions, and decimals. One key term in 6.1 will be percent. Let's take a look at problem 1 on page 390. What do these statements mean to you? There is an 80% chance of rain tomorrow. You earn 90% on a science test. Big sale, 25% discount on all regular priced items. Your bill at the Eat and Talk restaurant is $40. Below the total, the restaurant adds a 20% tip. The star of the high school basketball team makes 80% of his free throws. Sales tax is 7% in Richmond County. And finally, Yuma, Arizona, has sunny days 90% of the time. A percent is a fraction in which the denominator is 100. Percent is another name for hundredths. The percent symbol means out of 100. So with that definition in mind, 35% would mean 35 out of 100. 35% as a fraction would be 35 over 100. 35% as a decimal would be 0.35, and 35% as a ratio is 35 to 100, or if we write it in colon form, 35 to 100. You can also shade 35 of the 100 squares on the hundredths grid in order to represent 35%, as we see right here. Now, very, very important, percents, fractions, and decimals can all be used interchangeably, as you can see from the examples underneath the percent definition. Let's go ahead and turn to the top of page 391. It says that each hundredths grid represents a whole. Write the shaded part as a fraction, decimal, and percent. What I would like you to do is letters A, B, C, and D with your group members. I'll give you a couple minutes. Go ahead. So here is what you should have come up with for letters A through D. If we take a look first at letter A, 45 of the squares are shaded in, so that would represent 45 over 100 as a fraction, 0.45 as a decimal, and 45%. Letter B would be 11 hundredths, 0.11 as a decimal, 11%. Letter C, 70 over 100 as your fraction, 7 tenths as your decimal, or if you had 70 hundredths, those are both equivalent obviously, and 70%. And finally, letter D, 2 100ths, 0.02 for your decimal, and 2%. Let's turn to page 392. Number 2 says, shade the hundredths grid to represent each percent shown, then write the equivalent fraction and decimal for each percent. So go ahead and do letters A, B, C, and D with your group members. Here is what letters A through C should look like. For letter A, 44%. I have 44 squares shaded in, 44 over 100 for my fraction, and 0.44 for my decimal. For letter B, 16 of the squares shaded in, 16 over 100 for my fraction, and 0.16 for my decimal. And finally, for letter C, 97 of my squares are shaded in, 97 over 100 for my fraction, and 0.97 for my decimal. The last one, letter D, I have 117%, so I have one whole hundredths grid shaded in, and 17 additional ones on the second hundredths grid. That's going to give me 117 over 100 for my fraction. If I turn that into a mixed number, that would be 1 and 17 hundredths. And if I want to turn that into decimal form, 1.17. Let's take a look at number 3 at the top of page 393. It says to look back at the percents and the decimals that you wrote for question 2 to determine a pattern. Use this pattern to describe how you can write any percent as a decimal. And make sure you take a look at the word bubble here, our helper telling us to remember that a percent tells you how many hundredths. So look back at your answers for A through D on the previous page for number 2 and see if you can come up with a pattern on how you can write any percent as a decimal. If we take a look at the answer to number 3, all that you have to do is move the decimal point in a percent 2 places to the left in order to write that percent as a decimal. If you look back at letter A, you had 44%. If you move it over 2 spots, there's your decimal, 44 hundredths. For your decimal then for 44%. Same thing for letter B, you had 16%. If you move that decimal point 2 spots to the left, then you're going to have 16 hundredths for your decimal. Let's take a look at number 4 and number 5. First, what you're going to do in number 4 is write each percent as a decimal, so do A through D. And for number 5, you're going to write each decimal as a percent. I would also like you to do A through D for number 5 as well. Let's look at number 4 first. For letter A, we should have 12 hundredths, B 3 hundredths, letter C 80 hundredths, or if you had 8 tenths, and letter D 1 and 25 hundredths. For number 5, writing each of the decimals as a percent. For letter A, you should have 40%, letter B 37%, letter C 73.81%, and letter D 52%. Let's take a look at the bottom of page 393. Very important here. When the denominator is a factor of 100, scale up the fraction to write it as a percent. Remember, percent means out of 100. When the denominator is not a factor of 100, you can divide the numerator by the denominator to write the fraction as a decimal, which you can then write as a percent. So number 6 is asking you to write each fraction as a percent and round your answer to the nearest tenth. Now if you take a look again at the word bubble, it says use the scaling up method if the denominator is a factor of 100. So you can see that for letter A and for letter B, that those two denominators are indeed a factor of 100, so you should be able to use the scaling up method for those two problems. C and D, on the other hand, 8 and 3 are not factors of 100. So for those two questions, you can either use traditional division, or I will let you use a calculator to divide and turn into a percent. So go ahead and do number 6, A through D. Here is what your answers for number 6 should look like. For letter A, you should have 80%. My scaling up factor was 20. For letter B, you should have 30%. My scaling up factor was 10. For letter C, you should have 37.5%. I have the traditional division shown in order to come up with the correct answer. And the same thing for letter D, 33.3%. Remember, it said in the directions to round your answer to the nearest tenth. And if you think back to what we did up at the top of the page, if you are trying to write a percent as a decimal, you're moving your decimal place 2 spots to the left. If you want to take a decimal and convert it into a percent, then you're just going to do the opposite. You're going to move your decimal point 2 spots to the right. Let's turn to page 394 and finish up problem 1. It says for number 7, to label each mark on the number line with a fraction, decimal, and percent. Make sure that your fractions are in simplest form. So go ahead and do letters A, B, and C with your group members. If we take a look at letter A first, the first fraction that you need to fill in on the number line is 2/3. The decimal form of the fraction 1/3 would be 0.33 repeating, and the percents that you need to fill in, 0.33 or 1/3 would be 33.3%, and 2/3 or 66 hundredths would be 66.6%. The number line for letter B, if you look at the fractions that you needed to fill in from left to right, you should have 1/8, 1/4, 3/8, 5/8, and 3/4. The decimals then from left to right, 25 hundredths, 375 thousandths, 5/10ths, and 875 thousandths. And finally the percents from left to right, 12.5%, 50%, 62.5%, 75%, and 87.5%. And finally for letter C, the fractions from left to right, 1/5, 3/10ths, 1/2, 3/5, 4/5, and 9/10ths. The decimals from left to right, 1/10, 3/10, 4/10, 6/10, 7/10, and 8/10. And finally the percents, 10%, 20%, 40%, 50%, 70%, and 90%. Let's take a look at problem 2 on page 395. It says 100 6th grade students took a survey that asked questions about an upcoming class trip. Letter A says to complete the table to represent each survey result as a ratio using colon notation. Then you need to represent it as a fraction, as a decimal, and finally as a percent. Make sure that your fractions and ratios are in simplest form. So go ahead and get the table completed for letter A. Let's take a look at the first two sections of the table first. I'm just going to go column by column. If we take a look at the ratios first, you should have 3 to 5, 1 to 4, 3 to 20, 7 to 20, 11 to 50, 3 to 10, and 13 to 100. For the fractions, you should have 3/5, 1/4, 3/20, 7/20, 11/50, 3/10, and 13/100. For your decimals, you should have 6/10, 25/100, 15/100, 35/100, 22/100, 3/10, and 13/100. And finally, for the percents, 60%, 25%, 15%, 35%, 22%, 30%, and 13%. And for the last two sections, again, if you look at the ratios first, 1 to 4, 3 to 4, and 1 to 1. For the fractions, 1/4, 3/4, 1 whole. For the decimal, 25 hundredths, 75 hundredths, and 1.00, again 1 whole. And percent, 25%, 75%, and 100%. Let's take a look at letter B at the top of page 396. It says to write a summary of the results of the survey using percents. So go back, take a look at the table that you filled out, and I want you to write down 3 things from the table and just write out a summary of those 3 things and make sure that you use percents in your summary. Everyone's answers are going to vary. For letter B, a couple of things that I came up with. It shows that 60% of the students would like to stay overnight for at least 2 nights. 75% of the students would like to fly rather than ride a bus. And out of the 100 6th graders who responded, 35% would like to go to Philadelphia. So those are 3 things that I came up with. Hopefully you have a chance to talk with your group members and find some of these or others as far as a summary of the results. Let's finish up problem 2 at the bottom of page 396. It says on Saturday, Melanie won 3 out of 4 of her tennis matches at the Redstone tournament. On Sunday, she won 1 out of 4 of her matches at the Mesa tennis tournament. So take a look at Patrick, Laura, and Jonathan's reasoning and how they came up with solving the problems. What we are going to do is take a look at page 397. I would like you to answer letters A through D with your group members based off of what Patrick, Laura, and Jonathan did. Let's take a look at letter A and B first. What is wrong with Patrick's reasoning? Patrick assumed the denominators of each fraction represent the same whole, but they actually are representing two different wholes from the two different tennis tournaments that she was in, the two different events. So when you combine all the matches together, there's actually a total of 8 tennis matches, not 4 like he thought. For letter B, how did Laura make her reasoning explicit? Explicit means as specific as she can get. What she ended up doing was labeling her ratios to be more specific so that she could see how many matches that she won and how many matches that she played in on each of the days. If we take a look at letter C, it says, what is the same about Laura's and Jonathan's reasoning and what is different? Well, they both correctly determined the total number of matches won out of the total number of matches played, and the only thing that was really different was that Laura wrote her ratios in fraction form and Jonathan used colons. For letter D then, what ratio of matches did Melanie win? Melanie won 4 out of the 8 matches that were played. That is going to be it for lesson 6.1 and the introduction to percents. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.